Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Kataksha Kirana Chanta Naman Mohabdhaye Namaha Anantananda Krishnaya Jagan Mangalamurtaye. Om. Om. Good. Welcome back. We continue our Vedanta class, our study of Advaita Makaranda. And before we get to the verses, there's one question from the last class I'd like to address. Remember in the last class, verse 20, we discussed how Sakshi, the state of being the Atma as an awareful observer of the actions of your mind, that Sakshi, a awareful witness, we call it. I said that Sakshi is not a final perspective, for the text led us to understand how even the state of being Sakshi is not the ultimate understanding of Satchidananda Atma. So with regard to that discussion, the question came, I've always been of the understanding that Sakshi is not a vritti, but it is the non-changing witness of the three states. Two issues here. One is I never said Sakshi is a vritti. Sakshi is Atma, but not just Atma. Sakshi is Atma with reference to the mind which is being observed. So it's a definition that depends on something external. Therefore, it's not an absolute position. So first of all, Sakshi is not a vritti. Sakshi is Atma. But it's not our final understanding of Atma, since that definition depends on something other than Atma. The way we understand Atma is as Satchidananda, the unchanging limitless consciousness is our final understanding. A related issue I said is we have to be ready to let go. Remember I gave the metaphor of Vedanta works in stages, like you walk across a series of stones to cross a stream, and you have to be ready to let go of the prior stepping stone to move on to the next one. And this is an example where we have to be ready to let go even of the word Sakshi, even of the understanding of Atma as a awareful witness. Even that we have to let go of, because the ultimate perspective is one of Advaita, non-duality. And from the standpoint of non-duality, how can there be a witness and witnessed? That duality goes away. So Sakshi is an intermediate understanding, not a final understanding. In today's class, we're going to see a series of 3 verses that deal with our understanding of Atma as Sat, Chit, Ananda. There are many schools of thought, including the Nyaya and Vaisheshika schools of thought, that want to attribute attributes to Atma. Atma has attributes, qualities, like this cloth has the quality of orangeness. In the same way, Atma has 3 qualities, the qualities of Sat, Chit, and Ananda. And this is a common misunderstanding, to think that Sat, Chit, and Ananda are qualities of Atma. They're not qualities. The word we use is swarupa. Let's get some vocabulary. Let me go to the board and just get some basic definitions here. So if we have an object like a pot. That's our standard object. So that pot has a swarupa. Swarupa, you know, it means true nature, essential nature, just nature. And of course, the swarupa of a pot is clay. On the other hand, a pot also has many attributes. A pot can be large or small. A pot can be made of clay or some other material. A pot can be very deep or very shallow. It can have various colors and shapes. All of these are attributes. Words that we use for attributes, the kind of grammatical word is visheshana. Visheshana means attribute or adjective, but the words we're going to see in this series of 3 verses, the 2 words used are, one is guna. You already know guna as quality, but here we're not talking about the 3 qualities, sattva, rajas, and tamas. Remember, words are used differently in different contexts. So here, when we see the word guna in the coming 3 verses, it doesn't mean sattva, rajas, and tamas. It does mean an attribute. That's our topic. The other word we're going to see, which you may be surprised about, is dharma. And here, dharma, again, has a meaning determined by context. We're not talking about practicing ahimsa and what is your duty. That's not our context at all. The word dharma is also used to mean attribute. A common usage is the dharma of water is to be cold and wet. That's a specific meaning of dharma, one of many. If you look it up in a dictionary, there'll be probably a dozen definitions. This definition as attribute is one of those many definitions. So here we're talking about Sat, Chit, and Ananda. And the objection that we're handling in these 3 verses is that Sat, Chit, and Ananda are attributes. In fact, the 3 verses deal with Sat, Chit, and Ananda in sequence, the 3 verses. So the first verse is going to say Sat is an attribute of Atma. The second verse is going to say Chit is an attribute of Atma. And the final one will say Ananda is an attribute of Atma. And why is it so important to refute this point of view? An attribute is something that can change. A pot, you can change the color of a pot. You can apply paint and change the color. A pot can be intact, and then a pot can be broken. The word broken is an attribute. Visheshana. So you can have an intact pot or a broken pot. You can have a red pot or a green pot. Attributes can change. If Sat, Chit, and Ananda are attributes, they can change. So today you might be Sat, Chit, Ananda. Tomorrow you could be Asat, non-existent, Achit, insentient, and Ananda, miserable. The idea is that these are not attributes, they are swarupa. Notice a pot can be intact or a pot can be broken, but notice from the standpoint of its swarupa, it remains clay. Swarupa doesn't change. Attributes do change. And that's the basic idea of our discussion today. With that brief introduction, we can begin. Okay. Verse 22 deals with Sat. Swarupam eva me sattvam, swarupam eva me sattvam, na tu dharmo nabhastvavata, na tu dharmo nabhastvavata, maranyasya sato bhavan, maranyasya sato bhavan, nahi sajatirashyate, nahi sajatirashyate. May, first line, may, for me, sat tvam. The word sat plus that twa affix, the twa affix is like the English affix ness, the state or quality of being. And grammarians will call it an abstract noun. So satness, sattva, just like redness of a pot or the brokenness of a pot. So here, sattvam, satness, adding that twa onto sat attempts to make it look like an attribute. Looks like an attribute, but it's not an attribute. So sattvam, the state of being sat, real, existence, but remember our definition of real existence is that which existed without change in past, present, and future. That's our definition of sat. So that is me swarupam. That is my true nature. Swarupa is a word we used before. Swarupam eva. That alone, or that indeed, is my swarupa. Natu dharmaha. It is not a dharma. As we saw before, dharma is one of the words we use for attribute. So sat is my swarupa, my true nature. Sat is not a dharma, an attribute. And now he's going to give some reasons. First reason is nabhastvavata. It's like, it sounds funny in Sanskrit. We don't generally use words like nabhastva. Nabhas is space. Nabhastva, spaceness. It sounds very funny in Sanskrit. Even in English, it sounds very funny. What do you mean by spaceness? Space is not an attribute. Now, space can have attributes. Space, in the sense of air or atmosphere, space can be polluted. Space can be, you look up and you see the blue sky. So space can take on attributes of smokiness. Space can take on the attribute of blueness. If space is in a pot space, so space takes on smallness, or space fills the room and it takes on the attribute of bigness. So space can take on various attributes. Space itself is not an attribute. And that's the word here, nabhastva, spaceness, is I guess we call that a non sequitur. You can't call it spaceness because it's not a quality. In the same way, you can't call sat, sattva, existence-ness, because existence is not a quality. And he's going to develop this point as he continues. So he gives, so first reason is nabhastvavata. It is grammatically doesn't make any sense to think of sat as a quality any more than it makes sense to think of space as a quality. Space is, in grammatical terms, space is a substantive, not an attribute. In the same way, sat, in the expression Satchidananda Atma, sat is a substantive, it is not an attribute. First argument. Second reason, maranyasya sattaha abhavat. That abhavan, that na, gets changed due to grammar rules. is that maranyasya, mat here is the pronoun I in a compound. So maranyasya, other than me, sataha, maranyasya sataha, any sat, any kind of sat other than me, abhavat, doesn't exist. So this is the second reason. There is abhavat because of the non-existence, sataha, of any kind of sat, which is maranyasya, other than me. And it's a little obscure. Let's make it clear. Mat, me, I. The most fundamental truth is when you say, I am. I exist. I am. That's an expression of isness. We're back to this ness business. Isness. But here it's a little bit helpful to understand that this isness. Let's go back to this. And whenever I teach this topic, I remember my guru, Puja Swami Dayananda, who loved to use this expression, isness. And he would say the pot, in his Tamilian accent, the pot is. Pot is. It sounded like that to me anyway. The pot is. Therefore, the pot has isness, but is, sorry about this, is isness an attribute? Isness is, if isness is an attribute, then there is a pot without isness. Think, what? This is logic. If isness is an attribute of the pot, then you can have here we have a small pot and a bigger pot. So small and big are attributes. So you can have a small pot and you can have a big pot because small and big are attributes. But now if we say that this pot has an attribute of isness, this pot has an attribute of isness. So that suggests that if this pot has an attribute of isness, then just as you can have a small pot and a pot that is not small, therefore you should be able to have a pot that has isness and a pot that doesn't have isness. What does that mean? Doesn't exist. This is a little bit of logic to establish the fact that isness is not a quality. It is the essence of the essence of the pot is isness. Clay is the isness of the pot, and clay is not an attribute. Clay is the swarupa. In the same way, coming back to this, maranyasya, when maranyasya sataha, any kind of existence other than I am. When you say I am, to say I am is an expression of isness. Is it possible to remove that isness? Is it possible to have no isness? Then I am would go away. You would go away. So maranyasya sataha abhavat. There is no other existent sat. There is no other existent sat except for that which is expressed when I say I am. When I say I am, that is an expression of my isness. And that isness is not an attribute. That isness is my swarupa, my true nature. Now, one more argument. And this is a technical advanced text, so we have to be ready for several arguments. And this is an argument born of the logical schools of Nyaya and Vaisheshika. These are two schools of thought in ancient India, which would say that Sat is a jati. Now, jati is Species. How did I translate? Category. Species is perhaps a more accurate category, but species is like saying this object belongs to the category of pot. And this object, so there's a pot jati, a species called pot, a category of pot. And both of these objects possess the quality of belonging to the category of pot. This is how the logical people think. So they think of having the jati of pot. They look upon that as an attribute that belongs to these objects. And that kind of makes sense. I mean, we can see the reasoning of their line of thought. This belongs to the category of pot. This belongs to the category of pot. So the status of belonging to the pot jati, if I can use that expression, we can think of it as being an attribute. Well, we can think of them as being attributes for these objects called pots, but we're not talking about an object like a pot. We're talking about your swarupa, your true nature. So pot here, remember, pot is the object, and as we said before, that pot object has both a swarupa and has attributes. So the logicians want to say that the attribute of the pot is the fact that they belong to the pot category. Okay, that's their perspective, but we're not talking about attributes. We're talking about swarupa at the top. So even if you insist that this pot belongs to the category of pot, this object belongs to the category of pot, you can't use the same logic to say that Atma belongs to the category of Sat. That's what they try to say. Atma belongs to the category of Sat. And why do we not agree to that? As I said, because when we're referring to Sat, we're referring to Swarupa and not to an attribute. So we have to be... This argument is perhaps more compelling for someone who belongs to this Nyaya and Vaisheshika school of thought. It might not be such a big deal for you. It was a really big deal for them. Okay. So the first of the three arguments is that in the expression Atma is Sat, Chit, Ananda, the first argument is Sat is an attribute, and attributes might be present, might not be present. And here you can see how silly that is. Can you imagine, you can't have a pot without potness. I'm sorry, you can't have a pot without isness. Isness is Sat. The word Sat, if loosely speaking, is isness. So you can't have a pot without isness. Isness is not a quality. Isness refers to the swarupa, refers to the clay of the pot. In the same way, you can't have an Atma that's not Sat. An Atma that is not Sat is an Atma that doesn't exist. The expression the commentaries always use, it becomes like shashavishana, like the horns on a rabbit. Rabbits have no horns. Okay. Now, second argument in the... that's right. Yeah, correct. So in the next verse, we see the second argument. The second argument is that Chit, consciousness, is an attribute, not Swarupa, but an attribute. Let's see the verse. Swarupam eva me jnanam, Swarupam eva me jnanam, naguna saguno yadi, naguna saguno yadi anatmattvamasattvam va anatmattvamasattvam va gneya gneyatvayo patet gneya gneyatvayo patet. Me, for me, me swarupam, my true nature, is jnanam. Now here, jnana we often use to mean knowledge. But the word jnana, like the word dharma has many meanings, like the word guna has many meanings, the word jnana also has many meanings. One of them is chit, consciousness. In fact, it's not an uncommon meaning. In the expression satyam jnanam anantam brahma, that jnanam doesn't mean knowledge in the sense of your knowledge of something in the world. The word jnanam in the expression satyam jnanam anantam means consciousness, means chit, chaitanya. Chit and chaitanya are perhaps more common, but jnana is also used in the sense of consciousness. So, jnanam me swarupam eva, consciousness indeed or alone is my nature, and that jnanam, that consciousness, na gunaha, it is not a guna, it is not an attribute. So you can have a pot that is made that is small or big. So you can have a pot that has smallness. You can have a pot that does not have smallness. Smallness is an attribute. A pot can possess the attribute of smallness. A pot cannot possess the attribute of smallness. Is that true for Chit? Can Atma possess Chit as an attribute or not possess Chit as an attribute? Which means Atma might be conscious, Atma might not be conscious. There are plenty of people who think that consciousness ceases to exist in deep sleep, in dreamless sleep, or after death. We've had I won't go back through the arguments. We've discussed this extensively. How your consciousness remains utterly unchanged in deep sleep. You are as conscious in deep sleep as you are right now. We won't return to those arguments. But this is what this is the objection that's being addressed here, that perhaps consciousness is an attribute. So just as you can have a pot that is small or a pot that is not small, in the same way you can have Atma that is Chit or Atma that is achit. Achit means jara, inert, unconscious. And of course that's not the case, and here comes the argument. He says, saha gunaha yadi, if saha, that consciousness, if consciousness were a guna, a quality, then, and now here I have to introduce the logic here. And when you give a response, when a commentator gives a response to an argument, sometimes the response uses a divide and conquer strategy. Divide and conquer strategy means you divide up the situation into two or more cases, and then you take up each of those cases individually, and you show how each of those cases don't apply. And here, just to see what he's doing here, in the last line, he says, Gneya agneya tvayoho. He's giving two possibilities, and that is consciousness, chit, or jnanam, used here. Consciousness might be gneya, knowable, known, or consciousness might be agneya, unknowable, unknown. So he's giving these two possibilities. In Sanskrit, we call it vikalpa. Vikalpa means to make these different positions that we're going to consider. So what are the two positions? One position is that first of all, the leading question is consciousness a quality? Option A, consciousness is a quality which is knowable. Option B, consciousness is a quality which is unknowable. This is how these, especially in commentaries, less so in texts like this, but more so in commentaries. This is a very common style, divide and conquer style, is introducing vikalpas. So, what are the two possibilities? Possibility one, consciousness is a quality that is jnaya, knowable. Option two, consciousness is a quality that is ajnaya, unknowable. And that pretty much there's no third option, right? It's either knowable, consciousness is either knowable or unknowable as a quality, as an attribute. Consciousness as an attribute is either knowable or unknowable. And these are the two options given in the last line. And then the third line gives the consequences of these options. So the writing here is very terse. In a commentary, which is in prose, it wouldn't be so terse and it would be easier to understood. But when you take this complicated logic and put it into a short verse, it gets pretty dense. Okay. So in the first case, jnaya tvayoho, in the two cases of Atma being, of consciousness being a quality which is jnaya, knowable, or ajnaya, unknowable, in the first case, if Atma were jnaya, knowable, then what? In the third line, anatmatvam, and then you have to connect it with the verb at the end, patate. Patate, it would become anatma. Anatmatvam patate, if consciousness were an attribute that was knowable, then that consciousness, which is an attribute, would become anatma. So remember, the argument is it's an attribute of Atma. But if you say it is knowable, if consciousness is a knowable attribute, knowable to whom? Right? We've been through this logic before. Consciousness is the knower. Anything known is not. Atma, which is consciousness, is the knower. Anything known to Atma is not Atma. This is simple logic. Atma is the knower. Anything known to Atma is anatma. So look at the first vikalpa, the first option. If consciousness is a knowable attribute, the fact that it's knowable means it's anatma. So if consciousness is anatma, how can that consciousness be an attribute of Atma? So this is the logic of negating this possibility. So if consciousness is an attribute which is knowable, anything knowable is anatma, so consciousness cannot be a knowable attribute. That's the first option. Then the second option, suppose consciousness is ajnaya, unknowable. So the second option, if consciousness, so yadi saha gunaha, if consciousness is a guna, a quality, and that quality was ajnaya, unknowable, if consciousness is an unknowable quality, then what is the consequence? In the third line end, asatvam patate. Then it would become asatvam unreal. If consciousness was an unknowable attribute, it would be unreal. If consciousness was an knowable attribute, it would be unatma. It wouldn't be atma. If consciousness was an unknowable attribute, it wouldn't exist. Now, what is the basis for this argument? Consciousness is self-shining, self-revealing, like a flame. A candle flame reveals itself. It shines. In the same way, consciousness is self-shining, self-revealing. So therefore, if that self-shining, self-revealing consciousness was an attribute that was agneya, unknowable, unknowable would be like the flame that you don't see. A flame that you don't see is a non-existent flame. A flame that doesn't reveal itself, a flame that is not known to you, is a non-existent flame. In the same way, if consciousness is an attribute, and that attribute of consciousness is not known to you, then how can it exist? Consciousness is self-revealing. If it's self-revealing, it has to be known. If it's not known, it doesn't exist, as we said before, like the horns of a rabbit. A rabbit has no horns. A non-visible flame doesn't exist. And a consciousness which is unknown to you doesn't exist. Okay, a comment here. Look at the thoroughness of this logic, this divide and conquer strategy, creating these two vikalpas, frequently done in commentaries. So if consciousness is an attribute, it's either a knowable attribute or an unknowable attribute. And then we go ahead and address both possibilities. If consciousness is a knowable attribute, then being known to you, it's anatma. Anything known is anatma, therefore it cannot be a knowable attribute. And if it's an unknowable attribute, then any consciousness is self-revealing. If it's unknowable, it doesn't exist. Like the like the flame that you can't see doesn't exist. In the same way, the self-revealing consciousness that is unknown to you doesn't exist. Very sophisticated reasoning, but extremely complete. And it is the completeness of this reasoning. Just let me just make a side issue, side comment. Side comment is how the teachings of Advaita Vedanta have withstood the pressures of time. So for centuries and centuries, various schools of thought, like Nyaya and Vaisheshika, or like the Buddhists, or like the dualists, all of them have argued with Advaita Vedanta, argued sometimes in personal meetings, sometimes in texts and commentaries. There have been so many arguments created to dismiss the validity of these teachings of Advaita Vedanta. But you can see, with the thoroughness of this logic and reasoning, it is a solid edifice which cannot be torn down because it has such a solid foundation. The foundation we're using here is reasoning, but remember the foundation on which Vedanta is based is threefold, the threefold foundation: Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava. Shruti, scripture, scriptural revelation, teachings of the ancient rishis. Yukti, reasoning, manana, which is what this text is mostly about, and Anubhava, experience, which by the way connects to the nididhyasana, the Vedanta contemplation. Everything that we're discussing can be experientially confirmed in meditation. I didn't say you can experience it. I said your experience can confirm these teachings. The validity of his teachings can be experientially confirmed. So that is anubhava. Shruti, yukti, anubhava. This threefold foundation for Vedanta is so solid. It has withstood all kinds of arguments and will continue to do so. And here we see an excellent example of the thoroughness of that yukti, of the logical foundation on which Vedanta is based. The simple message, however, is that consciousness is not an attribute. Attributes come and go. A pot can be small or big. Atma cannot be conscious or unconscious, which means Atma cannot be unconscious in deep sleep. So here is some logic to support that. We've used other kinds of logic and experience also to support it. Here we see some logic to support that position, that consciousness is Swarupa. Just as Sat, existence, is not an attribute, it is Swarupa. In the same way, Chit, consciousness, is Swarupa, it is not an attribute. Okay, one more verse talking about Ananda. Ananda, the objection is Ananda is an attribute. And if Ananda is an attribute, or when you say Atma is Sat Chit Ananda, if Atma is an attribute, you can have a pot with smallness, you can have a pot without smallness. In the same way, you can have an Atma with Ananda, and you can have an Atma without Ananda, which doesn't sound very good. So, this is the argument addressed here in this final verse we'll see tonight. Ahameva sukham nanyata, ahameva sukham nanyata, anyat chenaiva tat sukham, anyat chenaiva tat sukham, amarartham nahi preyo, amarartham nahi preyo, marartham naswatah priyam, marartham naswatah priyam. Ahameva sukham. Sukha you probably know as pleasure, but here it means Ananda. And if you say, why didn't the author use Ananda? He's writing in these little verses where you have only 8 syllables in a quarter. Ananda has more syllables. Sukha has less syllables. So for a very practical reason, he uses Sukha instead of Ananda. But be very clear, by Sukha, he means Ananda. Ahameva Sukham. I am indeed Ananda. Which means Ananda is my Swarupa. Ananda is not an attribute. There is no Atma without Ananda. There's a pot with smallness. There's a pot without smallness. There is no Atma without Ananda. Why? So it says, Ahameva Sukham, my Swarupa is Sukha, na anyat. And here it's a little suggestive, na anyat, not otherwise, meaning Sukha is not an attribute. He doesn't use the word attribute, but the implication when he says na anyat, it is not other, it is not otherwise. So he means that that Sukha, here meaning Ananda, is Swarupa. Remember those words? So Ananda is Swarupa, the essential nature. Ananda is not an attribute, na anyat. Why? And here comes the arguments. Looks like 3 arguments. Okay, let's see this. He is very terse. Anyat chet. You're breaking the words apart. Chit, if anyat, if Ananda was an attribute, then na eva tat sukham, then it would not be sukha. And here again, sukha means Ananda. If Ananda were an attribute, it wouldn't be Ananda as we understand it. And here we need to make a distinction between two kinds of Ananda. Let me show you on the board. So we need to differentiate two kinds of Ananda to make sense of this topic. And the two kinds of Ananda we need to differentiate are Vishaya Ananda and Swarupa Ananda. Vishaya means object. Vishaya Ananda means the Ananda connected to an object. Swarupa Ananda means the Ananda which is not connected to an object, the Ananda which is your true nature. Now, having these words, we can explore this a little bit. Okay. When you enjoy something, will you give an example? Ice cream. When you enjoy ice cream, you feel some kind of Ananda. We'll call it Ananda, no problem with that. Call it ice cream Ananda. Ice cream Ananda is Vishaya Ananda. It is the Ananda associated with a Vishaya, an object, which is ice cream. But that enjoyment, here we need some proper Vedanta. That experience of bliss, that experience of ice cream Ananda, all experiences take place in your mind. All experiences take place in your mind in a form of vrittis. And vrittis, as we've discussed in some detail, vrittis are consciousness with a form. Just as this pot is clay with a form, in the same way the ice cream Ananda is consciousness in your mind with the form of ice cream Ananda. Let's make sure we get this. This pot is clay with this particular form. That's why we call it pot. Just as clay is the content and pot is the form, when you have the experience of ice cream Ananda, the content of that vritti is Atma, Satchidananda Atma. The content of every vritti is Satchidananda Atma. It's a form. What is the content? The content of the pot is clay. The content of every vritti is your swarupa, your essential nature as Atma, Satchidananda, which means the Ananda is part of the swarupa of the vritti. Look at here we need those two words. So you have the ice cream vritti, ice cream Ananda vritti, which is Vishayananda. What is the content of that vritti? The content of that vritti is Swarupa Ananda. The form of the vritti is due to the ice cream, but the content of that vritti is due to Sat Chit Ananda Atma. Now, with that in mind, I think we can manage this line now. Anyat chet, if Ananda were just a changing attribute, like ice cream Ananda, then na eva tat sukham, that would not be the Ananda, which is the Swarupa. This is a rather subtle. Let me see if we can make this metaphor work. We differentiate between the form and content. Pot is the form, clay is the content. In the same way, with every vritti, we differentiate between form and content. Ice cream Ananda, Vishaya Ananda, is form. The content of that vritti is Ananda Atma. The form is ice cream Ananda, but the content is Atma, is you. Do you know, I know this is perhaps challenging Vedantic teaching, but the simple truth you understand very well. You experience some Ananda when you eat ice cream. And we've had this discussion in many classes where we've asked, does the Ananda actually come from the ice cream? Is Ananda an ingredient in the ice cream? And the statement everyone says is, no, happiness comes from within. Everyone says that, but what does it mean? When you say happiness comes from within, it means you're referring to the Swarupa Ananda. So we can say the Vishaya Ananda, ice cream Ananda, comes from outside. It's the form. But the Swarupa Ananda comes from inside. It's the true nature of Atma. So this is why he says, wrong button. There we go. This is why he says here that wrong verse. Anyat chet, if Ananda were an attribute, it would be like the form of pot. Na eva tat sukham, but it would not be the Ananda which is your Swarupa. So here we make that clear distinction between form and content, between Vishaya Ananda and Swarupa Ananda, the difference between, in simple terms, the difference between the ice cream experience and the true source of happiness, joy, and pleasure, which is within you. So the reasoning is a little bit difficult, but the truth is so simple. Happiness is your true nature. Now he gives two more arguments here. And we'll see these arguments. Amarartam nahi preyaha. Oh, this is another divide and conquer strategy. In responding to this idea, if Ananda were an attribute, now the two possibilities are Ananda is an attribute which is madartam. It is not for my sake. You see the words at the beginning of the third and fourth lines. Amadartam and madartam. Mad is a pronoun me. Madartam, for my sake. Amadartam, not for my sake. So, and what is he saying here? So this is the divide and conquer strategy. So if Ananda is an attribute, that attribute should either be madartam, it should be happiness for my sake, or amarartam, happiness which is not for my sake. This is the divide and conquer strategy, the two vikalpas. So the first example he gives is amarartam. So if there is some attribute, some experience, which is amadartam, which is not for my sake, meaning if it doesn't bring happiness to me, if there is something that ice cream brings happiness to me, a hamburger will not bring happiness to me. So a hamburger, actually the commentator gives the example of a poisonous snake. We'll go with his example. Ice cream might bring happiness to me, but a snake will definitely not bring happiness to me. So therefore, that nahi prayaha, it is not desirable. I would not desire it. So this, in the divide and conquer strategy here, if Ananda were an attribute, and that attribute were like the snake, then obviously, this is kind of the obvious possibility, I would not consider that Ananda. I don't like snakes. And most people don't like snakes. So that is possibility one. If Ananda were an attribute, and that attribute was amadartam, was not for my sake, if it didn't bring Ananda to me, then it's not Ananda. What is the second possibility, though, is the more interesting one. Suppose Ananda is an attribute which is madartam, which is for my sake, makes me happy. The ice cream makes me happy. Then you would conclude, okay, well, then that attribute is Ananda. No, it's refuted here. Why? If it is madartam, if ice cream makes me happy, then na swataha priyam. Then it is not desirable, priyam, it is not desirable swataha in and of itself. If ice cream makes me happy, it might not make someone else happy. Of course, ice cream, many people like ice cream, but suppose somebody is diabetic or somebody doesn't like cold things. Some people have problems with their teeth, and ice cream will make their teeth hurt. So therefore, ice cream is not a universal source of happiness. And that's the argument that's being given here in the last line. So if Ananda, in the first possibility, if Ananda is an attribute which doesn't make me happy, then it's not Ananda. Second possibility is if Ananda is an attribute which does make me happy. It makes me happy, but it might not make someone else happy. Therefore, that desirability is not the essence of that object. It's peculiar. One person likes it, another person may not like it. It is not a universal. On the other hand, Ananda is a universal. We all want peace. We all want contentment. We all want Ananda. Now, just to finish this up, this last argument about Swarupa. This is not from the verse, but this is an important Vedantic teaching, and we'll conclude our class with this final observation. It's an interesting argument. The argument goes like this. If Ananda, if the absence of Ananda was your Swarupa, was your true nature, then you would be comfortable with it. That which is natural is something that we're comfortable with. But the fact is that we are comfortable with Ananda. We're not comfortable with the absence of Ananda. And the example that's given is if you get a speck of dust in your eye. As small as that speck of dust is, it's enough to make you very uncomfortable. And it makes you uncomfortable because that speck of dust doesn't belong there. It is unnatural there on your eye. When you remove the speck of dust, you return to a natural state, like the state of health, a natural state, a state of the eye without the speck of dust, the state of the body without illness or disease. This natural state is what we seek. And the natural state, we're referring here to the body, the natural state for your essential nature, Atma, that Atma is Sat, existence, that isness, reality. That Atma is Chit, consciousness, and not as an attribute, that which is fundamental to your nature, unchanging consciousness, and your true nature is Ananda. That is your natural state of being content, your natural state of being at peace. This is the teaching. We'll conclude here. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhaveta Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.